That's part of that is just like go ahead and you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, because that's a symbol that
Yeah.
it's like great held up.
Are you putting together some sort of exhibition with Joanne on clothing or something like that?
We've been talking about it, but
Did you make
thinking
that?
about doing
No, it
It
was
looks very homemade.
titled like
my
contemporary traditional.
great aunt Joe's. So she might have made it. I
Really?
don't think she's there.
Doesn't look very old.
I know. I think it
Very
must have been like her
vibrant.
special apron
Yeah.
or something.
Last year, and it's got an image of something that was in the display or
Taking advantage of
I
the
thought you might be interested in.
Yeah.
And so
I mean, we just been bouncing the idea around, but we haven't like made any formal plans or anything.
So a big collection here.
I can't remember. Did you get to engage with Gayogohó to some
So
Yeah, it's really great.
there's it's of
I had a bunch of stuff this weekend. I was hoping to go to her
Oh, no shit.
Saturday talk. Did you go to that?
That's exactly the kind of thing.
no, I
That's why we want to call it contemporary traditional.
it's called So
You
it's
were there, yeah?
Yeah.
For what?
There's a
For her
pair of pumps.
performance here, yeah, but not the other one.
So she was the artist.
She visited your class
So
as well?
this exhibit that
She visited
Katie put
the
together
undergrads,
was on
and I TA at that time. Which I
spent time with items in the collection.
Okay, and it's kind of drawn on it.
Yeah, yeah. And so they were exhibited next to each other. It was all at the basket dress with all this amazing work on it. It inspired this singer artist to make the dress. So
That's what it sounds like a wonderful.
it was really interesting though how almost
Was it like work?
it was at the Berg last year. Very cool.
Yeah.
So Katie would be able to
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah.
There were a few items that were like that. People were, like one of the artists was inspired by the
she would let some of that exhibit travel.
It's not going on. Oh, the original collection, the old collection, or the new? I don't think they inquired.
What did you guys read for
I
this?
think it was just for the.
For that show.
Troy passed along chapter 5
Of the Redskin?
Masks, and then the intro and the first chapter.
I wonder if it would be possible to
Yeah.
reconnect it.
I read it like a
Although
year
it's
ago.
expensive to bring
Have it more. It's a good refresher.
Why did you read it a year ago?
the older pieces from the
I think
museum.
I'm trying to remember how I came across it. It might have been reading
Very, very sensitive.
Leanne Simpson and it came up, or I don't know. It came up in some other reading.
This biennial is on the cultural
It wasn't assigned, was it assigned? Was
and so we could think about
it
No.
on somebody's syllabus?
Well, good morning.
and see if we could.
Welcome to the American Indian program and the seminar series this semester. My name is Troy Richardson, coming to you from the Sakonee and Tuscarora Nations of what's now Virginia, North Carolina. And I want to acknowledge and recognize our place here and the traditional territories of the Cayuga people and the larger Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It's a real privilege to have you with us this morning. I also want to open by thanking the American Indian Studies and American Indian Program staff and leadership. Ula, Natani, Mario, Jolene, Kathy, and Bianchi, who handles all of our financial matters, who really, it's a team effort that puts this seminar together year after year. So I want to personally thank them yet again for all of their efforts and energies for bringing this together. If you're unfamiliar with the seminar, our format is typically this part of the process or morning is dedicated to a public talk by our guest, and then we host a lunch for ongoing kind of formal discussions, and then we move to a smaller seminar environment for the students who are actually enrolled in this for credit as a course. And then we get a little bit of time to discuss some additional work and readings. So it's a real privilege to have Glen Coulthard back with us. Glen was part of a conference, I guess it was, several years back on syndicalism and anarchism that some folks here put together. That's the initial context, I guess, that we met and have been in some conversations since then. Glen is an assistant professor, soon be, I think it's fair to say, associate professor in the First Nation Studies program and the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. He's written and published numerous articles and chapters in the areas of contemporary political theory, Indigenous thought and politics, and radical social and political thought, more specifically Marxism, anarchism, and post-colonialism. His more recent work, Redskin, White Masks, if you're familiar with the book, is on Fanon and the politics of recognition, and his article, which was the title of that article?
Subjects of Empire.
Subjects of Empire, yes. Won the Contemporary Political Theory's annual award for Best Article in 2007. That's from Gayogohó Nation in
Northwest Territories.
Northwest Territories. Thank you. So please help me welcome Glen to Cornell, and more specifically, the American Indian program.
Mussy, for inviting me here, for everybody who got me here safe, and you've been wonderful hosts. Also like to acknowledge Cayuga territory that we're all situated on here today. Yeah, this is my second visit to Cornell, and both of them have so far been really good. I like my anarchy heavy league, apparently. So I was asked, when Troy Offer reached out to invite me kindly here, he said you could talk about pretty much anything you wanted, including, because you'd be reading parts of the book, I think, so maybe include some of that in. So what I've done is I'm going to present to you some new work that I'm doing that came in the wake of writing Redskin White Mass and actually in its reception, particularly in the US. The reception of it it's been lucky enough to be quite good across the board, but when I come to the US, most of the challenges that come from the work is my use of Frantz Fanon, so the political theory of Frantz Fanon. And it's not in relationship to necessarily his relevance for Indigenous politics, which I make kind of clear in the book, but it's this kind of weird ownership model over Fanon's thought in general that happens within Fanon's studies, and got taken up within Black studies in particular in some pretty scathing critiques of what we do in Indigenous studies. So because I don't really situate my use of Fanon in the book, I started thinking about, well, what is this kind of intellectual inheritance that I've kind of taken on with respect to Fanon, and then I started to write an essay on Fanon's kind of appropriation and misappropriation in the Canadian context, both in theory and in terms of struggle. So that's what I'm going to present with you today, and it's actually kind of working itself into an introduction for a new book that I'm writing, or an introduction that I'm writing for a compilation on essays that deal with similar themes. So in a fairly well-known essay titled Traveling Theory Reconsidered, the great Palestinian critic Edward Said revisits a claim that he made in his 1984 book, The World, the Text, and the Critic, regarding the ways in which theoretical interventions, originally born of and informed by very specific historical, material, and ideological contexts, but are then transposed onto other situations, often become domesticated in this process. And in the case of radical theory, lose their transformative character as they travel from one place to another, from one time to another. Said's case in point in his earlier take on this phenomenon is the reception of George Lukács's masterpiece, History and Class Consciousness, which after time he claims gets taken up by fellow Marxist travelers in an overly conciliatory manner as they grapple with the subject-object dialectic that reification produces under conditions of capitalist class rule. So why then does Said eventually reconsider this originally quite depressing interpretation of theory's immobility a number of years later in Traveling Reconsidered? Or said differently, what prompts Said to recognize the transformative, even radical potential of theory's ability to develop and deepen, quote, away from its original formulation, but instead of becoming domesticated, restates and reaffirms its inherent tensions by moving to another site? To answer this question, Said turns our attention, if only speculatively, to Frantz Fanon's 1961 masterpiece, The Wretched of the Earth, which Said suggests was perhaps penned with the first publication of the French edition of History Class Consciousness fresh in his mind. As Said postulates, and I'll quote here at length, how strongly the object or subject-object dialectic resonated with those outside of Europe, and for an audience made up of colonial subjects, is immediately apparent from the opening pages of The Wretched of the Earth. The Manichaean relationship that Fanon describes is, quote, separating the clean, well-lit colonial city and the vile, disease-ridden darkness of the Kasbah, recalls the alienation of Lukács's reified world. And Fanon's whole project is to first illuminate and then animate the separation of the colonizer and the colonized, in order that what is false, brutalizing, and historically determined about the relationship might become clear, stimulate action, and lead to the overthrow of colonialism itself. So today I want to frame my discussion by taking Said's questions concerning the maneuverability of theory in general, and the mobility of Fanon's theorization of the colonial situation and its eventual transformation in particular. Does, for instance, Fanon's theory travel in the sense discussed by Said? That is, can it be uprooted from its specific time and place and applied to diagnose different colonial formations and relationships? And if so, at what cost or to what benefit? More specifically, I'll be talking about the at times contradictory ways that Fanon has been used in the Canadian context within which I write, with the aim of acknowledging not only his profound and lasting significance, but also some of the limitations that can arise with theory is left to travel too far from its original time and place. So to begin, I'll start by saying just a very little bit about Fanon's life and then move on to discuss his legacy in terms of how we think about colonization and decolonization in our present context through a brief discussion of my own work that I undertake in Red Skin, White Masks. So, of course, Fanon was born and raised in the French Caribbean colony of Martinique in 1925. The son of middle-class parents, he belonged to a relatively small minority of Martinician black youth whose upbringing included a post-secondary education. In high school, Fanon took courses with the celebrated negritude poet César, whose writings would have a lasting influence on his political perspectives and activism. In 1943, after completing high school, Fanon left Martinique to join the French Army's campaign against fascism in World War II. 2 years later, he returned to Martinique and again ended up working with César, this time in his mentor's campaign for the mayor of Martinique's capital city, Fort-de-France, under the banner of the local Communist Party. Fanon's wartime experience would have a radicalizing effect on him, particularly regarding his views on race and colonialism. It was during his time fighting for the French state that Fanon would experience firsthand the psychological effects that unrepentant white supremacy of his French comrades could have on those who were subject to it, particularly himself. It was this experience that would eventually come to inform aspects of his 1952 phenomenological account of the effects of colonial racism in his masterful first text, Black Skin, White Masks. Then in 1947, Fanon would again leave Martinique, this time to study psychiatry in Lyon, France. While a medical student, Fanon read extensively in continental philosophy, including, among others, the work of Hegel, Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, Lacan, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, all of which would have a lasting influence on both his scholarship and on his views of colonialism and racism. After completing his studies in 1953, Fanon accepted a position at Blaye-Joinville Psychiatric Hospital in Algiers. The year after Fanon relocated to Algiers, the Algerian War of Independence broke out, which lasted from 1954 to 1962. Finding it increasingly difficult to work under conditions influenced by French militarization, occupation, violence, and torture, Fanon permanently resigned from his hospital position at Blaye, renounced his French citizenship, and joined the ranks of Algeria's Revolutionary National Liberation Front as editor of their publication El Moudjihad. Fanon's experience in Algeria would eventually provide the contextual backdrop for his 1959 compilation of political essays on the Algerian independence struggle titled A Dying Colonialism, and then, of course, his classic 1961 treatise on decolonization, The Wretched of the Earth, which was published shortly after his untimely death from leukemia earlier the same year. Now, Fanon's theoretical influence in North America, especially in the United States, has been well noted by scholars such as Homi Bhabha, Stuart Hall, and others. In particular, Fanon's writings on colonial racism and national liberation indelibly shaped the more militant arm of the civil rights movement, as well as both the Black Power and, to a certain extent, the Red Power movements in the 1960s. One can read both explicit and implicit traces of Fanon's thought, for example, in the writings of the great militant Malcolm X, of Huey Newton and Bobby Seale of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and of course in the writings of ex-Panther Eldridge Cleaver, who was once famously quoted by saying that at the heyday of the Black Power movement, quote, every brother on a rooftop could quote Fanon. The profound mark that Fanon left on 1960s and 70s anti-colonial radicalism led Jamaican-born cultural theorist Stuart Hall to declare The Wretched of the Earth nothing less than the Bible of decolonization. Interestingly, however, Fanon's influence is perhaps even more pronounced, but entirely less discussed, it's not discussed at all really, in Canada. For instance, in the 1960s, Quebec sovereigntists often borrowed the language of Fanonian anti-colonialism in their struggles for national recognition, while largely ignoring both the fact that they were white and that Fanon's insights into the problem of recognition in colonial contexts, which I discuss later, are quite profound. But also, and more importantly, that Quebec's own problematic status as a white settler colony actively complicit in the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in the province is entirely overlooked. Fanon's influence on Quebec nationalism is particularly evident in the writings of Pierre Valliere, especially his infamously titled book, White Niggers of America, written from prison and published in 1968. While Vallier does not discuss Fanon explicitly, he nonetheless refers to himself as one of the wretched of the earth, providing testament to the subtle influence of Fanon's work in relationship to Quebec's contradictory standing as both colonizer and colonized. To many within the Quebec sovereignty movement of the 1960s, Vallier was considered an intellectual hero of the Front de Libération du Québec, or FLQ, which was the armed faction of the Quebec separatist movement, often drawing on Fanonian kind of affirmations of decolonial violence. Although he eventually distanced himself from the organization after its high-profile abduction and murder of Quebec's vice premier, Pierre Laporte, in 1970. The point to note here, as David Austin has reminded us, is that, quote, while anti-colonial ideas found fertile ground in Montreal, none took root as firmly as those of Fanon. As far as traveling theory is considered, Quebec's anti-colonialism in the 1960s came via Martinique through Fanon. The questionable appropriation of Fanonian insights applied to the Canadian context didn't stop with the Quebec sovereigntists, however, and this is where it gets pretty fucking weird. Indeed, never to be one done by pesky separatists, none other than the Prime Minister himself, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who's a new Trudeau in town these days, his son, invokes Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth in a 1964 article titled Separatist Counter-Revolutionaries, in which he challenges the political claims of Quebec separatists. In his characteristically arrogant and snarky piece, Trudeau blasts Quebec's nationalists for failing to do their homework by not reading Fanon's perceptive critique of nationalism in his chapter, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, by instead focusing exclusively on The Wretched of the Earth's first intoxicating chapter on the revolutionary use of violence and struggles for national independence. This is our Prime Minister at the time. Here's a quote from Trudeau's passage in question. Quote, some of the counter-revolutionaries deceived themselves by dressing up in a Marxist-Leninist disguise, as has already been done by those African chieftains who, indeed, they take as their models. But all this masquerading has been admirably described by Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, which nevertheless our counter-revolutionaries say is the book they keep by their bedside. This makes me think, continues Trudeau condescendingly, that they have read no more in bed than elsewhere. So I shall do them a favor and quote at length from Fanon's text published in 1961, and of which the counter-revolutionaries have perhaps only leafed through the first chapter on violence. And then he goes in and quotes from Pitfalls of National Consciousness. So Trudeau's theoretical analysis might be interesting if it weren't premised empirically on pure make-believe. First, much like his own criticism of the separatist counter-revolutionary selective reading of Concerning Violence, Trudeau's response draws exclusively from Fanon's critique of the national bourgeoisie in The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. Fanon's affirmation of a radically transnational nationalism grounded and informed by place but not ensnared by it is nowhere to be found in Trudeau's polemic. And second, wasn't it Trudeau, along with Jean Chrétien, who was as Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, that crafted the profoundly colonial piece of proposed legislation appropriately called the White Paper in 1969, which called for the legal and political elimination of First Nations as peoples with a corresponding right to land and self-determination. The core concerns animating the decolonization struggles of the post-war period and recognized by Fanon as such. Yes, he was, and as such I think that we can safely presume that Fanon would be rolling in his grave regarding his interjection into the largely white melodrama, colonial melodrama, that constituted this back and forth bickering between weak-kneed Canadian federalists like Trudeau on the one hand and misled Quebec sovereigntists on the other. In 1980s and 90s, we begin to see a middle ground charted between these two camps, with Charles Taylor's work on recognition being the paradigmatic example. Responding to the increased demands for recognition made by the first Quebec and then Indigenous nations, Charles Taylor's work draws on Fanon and others to map the contested relationship between the recognition of cultural distinctiveness on the one hand and the freedom of marginalized individuals and groups living in ethnically diverse states on the other. In his 1992 essay, The Politics of Recognition, Taylor argues that the political communities, in political communities such as Canada, They ought to provide recognition and accommodation for certain sub-state national groups because it is within our cultural frameworks that we develop a sense of self or who we are as who we are. And this enables us to make the meaningful life choices that we do in life. So for Taylor, as culturally situated beings, we do not develop our identities in isolation. Rather, we form them through complex relations of recognition with others. And given that our identities are formed in this manner, it also follows, according to Taylor, and this is where he's drawing off of Fanon, that our identities can be significantly deformed when these processes are hostile and asymmetrical. In this sense, our identities are not only shaped by recognition, but famously quoted by Taylor, often by misrecognition of others. Thus, Taylor writes, a person or a group of people can suffer real damage or real distortion if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. Non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict harm, can be a form of oppression, imprisoning oneself in a false, distorted, and reduced mode of being. It is this idea that unequal relationships of recognition can impede human freedom and can continue to serve as one of the main theoretical justifications for state policies geared towards recognizing and protecting of Indigenous cultural difference, according to Taylor. Now, in the second half of the Politics of Recognition, Taylor identifies Fanon's classic, The Wretched of the Earth, as one of the first texts to really unpack the perils of misrecognition and how they are used to shore up relationships of domination. By extension, Fanon's analysis in The Wretched is also used to support one of his political claims in the book, and that's for the argument for the recognition and accommodation of Indigenous peoples as well as Quebec Nation within Canada. I'll have more to say about Taylor's work later. Now, more on the mark, however, has been Fanon's imprint on the intellectual output of Indigenous scholars and activists working against the colonial forces of both Quebec and Canada. Out of all Red Power era activists, Fanon's impact was most influential on the work of the late Métis historian Howard Adams. Although he was taken very seriously by Indigenous feminists like Lee Miracle at the time, and nationalists like those working in the context of my own community's struggle for self-determination in the Dene Nation. And I don't talk about the Dene Nation here, but there's a lot of Fanonian influence in it, and if Fanon came into Quebec via Martinique, Fanon's influence came through or to the Dene Nation via our relationship with Tanzania at the time, but I won't talk about that, or we can talk about that later. As a child growing up in rural Saskatchewan, Adams witnessed the convergence of economic exploitation with anti-Native and anti-Métis racism firsthand, and this experience would have a lasting impact on his political activism and scholarship. The influence of these early life experiences of Adams' intellectual and political development was compounded by his graduate school experience at the University of California at Berkeley during the turbulent 1960s decade of radical student activism. It was during this period that Adams was first introduced to the literature of the Black Power movement, particularly influenced by Malcolm X and Eldridge Cleaver, and the writings of Third World anti-colonialists like Kwame Nkrumah and Albert Memmi, as well as the existential Marxism as Sartre and Fanon. The combination of all of these experiences would come to significantly shape the theoretical and historical analyses developed by Adams in his two major political works, namely the 1975 text Prison of Grass, Canada from a Native Point of View, and his 1995 follow-up, A Tortured People, The Politics of Colonization. Out of all of Adams' intellectual influences, however, the most obvious, aside from perhaps Marx, is that of Fanon. Indeed, the structure of both Prison of Grass and A Tortured People is heavily indebted to the phenomenological narrative style deployed by Fanon in several of his own writings, in particular his earlier ones. As such, Adams' point of departure in both Prison of Grass and A Tortured People is like Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, phenomenological. The result is at times an excruciating portrayal of his own personal experience of colonial alienation at the hands of a racist colonial capitalist state and society. In recounting his childhood experiences of growing up in a half-breed ghetto in a world divided in two, to borrow without reference Fanon's terminology in the Wretched, Adams vividly depicts the all too common effects of internalized colonial racism, arguing that it is through this process that colonialism is able to secure its dominance over indigenous lands and bodies by warping the behavior and self-image of colonized individuals and communities in ways that make our dispossession and political subjugation appear natural to ourselves. In other words, they come to appear as an appropriate response to our own cultural, quote, inferiority and backwardness, to use Adams' own terminology borrowing off of Fanon. So what is it about Fanon's theoretical contribution that has had such a lasting hold on the decolonial imagination of scholars and activists working within the settler colonial context of Canada? A number of speculative points could be raised here, but I think that at its core, it was because of the post-war period saw decolonization struggles clearly eclipse those of international yet narrowly construed class struggle. Struggles that foregrounded battles over turf and alternative associated forms of life as much as they did on the exploitation of laboring bodies. So this is where my own work with Fanon steps into this conversation. Basically, I focus on Fanon's insights into the problem of recognition in colonial situations. That is, I set out to problematize the increasingly commonplace and profoundly misplaced assumption that the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the settler state can be reconciled via a liberal politics of recognition in the way that Taylor says it can. I characterize the politics of recognition as a recognition-based approach to reconciling Indigenous peoples' presence, i.e. their assertions of nationhood, with the settler state sovereignty via the accommodation of our differences through negotiations over things such as land, governance, and economic development. So I argued that this orientation to the reconciliation of Indigenous nationhood with state sovereignty is fundamentally colonial still, insofar as it remains structurally committed to the dispossession of our peoples of our lands and of our self-determining authority and capacity. In short, settler colonialism is a structure of domination, I argue, maintained through force, fraud, and manufactured consent, which has as its telos the theft of Indigenous lands for the purposes of state formation, settlement, and capitalist accumulation. My conceptualization of settler colonialism as a structure of domination predicated on the dispossession of our people's lands and political authority drew significantly from two theoretical resources: Karl Marx's writings on the primitive accumulation of capital, and Fanon's anti-colonial critique of Hegel's master-slave parable when applied to colonial situations. So with respect to Marx, I claim that chapters 26 through 33 of his first volume of Capital is crucial because it's there that Marx most thoroughly links the totalizing power of capital with that of colonialism by way of his theory of primitive accumulation. Essentially challenging the idyllic portrayal of capitalism's origins by bourgeois economists like Adam Smith, Marx's chapters on primitive accumulation highlight the gruesomely violent nature of the transition from feudal to capitalist social relationships in Western Europe, with particular emphasis paid to England and Scotland. Marx's historical excavation of the birth of the capitalist mode of production identifies a number of colonial-like state practices which he claims served to violently strip, through, quote, conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, non-capitalist producers and communities from their means of production and subsistence, which in this context is largely the land. In Capital, these formative acts of dispossession set the stage for the emergence of capitalist accumulation and the reproduction of capitalist relations of production by tearing native societies, peasants, and other small-scale agricultural communities from the land. And it was this horrific process that established the two necessary preconditions in Marx's mind that are necessary for capitalism itself. First, it opened up what were once held, collectively held lands to dispossession and privatization, which then would come to produce a class of workers that had no other means to survive other than to sell their time in the form of a wage and labor. This, for Marx, was the historical process that violently transformed non-capitalist forms of life into capitalist ones. Now, in my this is just a tangent, in my more recent work, I'm writing a book on a critique of settler political economy, and primitive accumulation actually has another two constitutive features to it, which are quite crucial in understanding kind of the colonial geography of settler states like Canada. So there's dispossession, which results in proletarianization, but it also creates the conditions for a market. And then it also creates a spatial reorganization of populations, which results in a massive sort of increase in urbanization. So I started to think about this because I wanted to make a less metaphorical link between urban redevelopment and displacement caused by gentrification, and how native spaces are being kind of recolonized in urban contexts with this larger process of dispossession that is core to capitalist settler states like Canada. So anyway, as insightful as Marx's primitive accumulation thesis is, I argue that there's a number of things that need to be addressed within his work to make it kind of in sync with what we're talking about here and experiencing here in Canada and the US. First, I argue that Marx's thesis on primitive accumulation must be stripped of what I call its temporal character. That is, rather than positing primitive accumulation as some historically situated inaugural set of events that set the stage for the development of the capitalist mode of production through colonial expansion, we should see it as an ongoing practice of dispossession that never ceases to structure capitalist colonial social relations in the present. There's one unique thing about primitive accumulation, and I've learned this through conversations with my friend Rob Nichols, is that before primitive accumulation, so before the dispossession of the peasantry that transitioned from feudalism to capitalism, there was no market in land in the sense that would, like in a global context. So primitive accumulation actually was for the first time made a commodity that could be sold on a capitalist market that was land. And this exponentially increases the drive expansion. So by the time we get to like somewhere like Canada or the US, there's already a market in land that is kind of structurally compelling an outward motion from the metropole to the periphery in terms of colonial expansion. Second thing I argued is that Marx's primitive accumulation thesis must be stripped of what I call its normative developmentalist character. So it's correct to view primitive accumulation as the condition of possibility for the development of capitalism. It's incorrect to view it as a necessary condition for developing the forms of critical consciousness and associated modes of life that ought to inform the construction of alternative to capitalism in settler colonial contexts. I also suggest that Marx himself came to understand the problematic character of this kind of teleological story later in his life, particularly after the fall of the Paris Commune in 1871, partially because he started to look into non-Western struggles because of the collapse of the labor movement after the smashing of the Paris Commune. And finally, I argued that the forms of colonial power associated with primitive accumulation need not be understood as strictly coercive, repressive, or explicitly violent in nature. Rather, the practices of dispossession central to the maintenance of settler colonialism in liberal democratic contexts like Canada rely as much on the productive character of colonial power as it does on the coercive authority of the settler state. Seen from this angle, settler colonialism should not be seen deriving its reproductive force solely from strictly repressive or violent features, but rather through its ability to produce forms of life that render settler colonialism's constitutive hierarchies endurable, even seem natural. Now, Indigenous feminists, as much as I've been informed by Indigenous feminist thought and activism, I've been challenged on this idea that we're moving from some sort of form of hard power in the form of violence to soft power mitigated through the symbolic violence of recognition. And I do claim that in the book that violence always stands as kind of a hammer that will be called upon if our subjectivities aren't shaped in ways that kind of reproduce colonial power relations. And that when those subjectivities kind of are resistant or resurgent, you'll see spectacular instances of violence come back to the fore. So we think of Oka as a good example, Gustafson Lake, it happens in 5-year cycles in Canada, really. But I don't think that that's significant, and Indigenous feminist analysis have challenged me to say, or to kind of revisit this and the kind of the settler colonial violence that occurs in Indian country is always and has been distributed unequally among our communities in ways that affect different bodies differently. And in particular, Indigenous women and queer bodies are always consistently subject to settler colonial violence in the way that isn't at the fore of these things in either armed conflicts or in the context of recognition politics and negotiations. And this point was made really clear to me in my exchanges with my friend and colleague Sarah Hunt, who's an Indigenous geographer that we just hired in BC. So to tease out the productive character of settler colonial power, I turn to, in my mind, at least one of Marx's greatest interlocutors, the theoretical contribution, of course, of Fanon. One of the central concerns animating Fanon's analysis, especially in Black Skin, White Mass, but remaining important throughout his work, is the problem of recognition in situations that are marked by colonial violence and racism. In this sense, Black Skin, White Mass ought to be interpreted much like his comrade Jean-Paul Sartre's being in Nothingness, Anti-Semite and Jew, and Black Orpheus, as a practical reworking of Hegel's master-slave relation in contexts where the possibility of achieving a mutual affirmative recognition appears foreclosed. Like Sartre's portrayal of intersubjectivity and being in nothingness, Fanon's phenomenological account of being for others in Black Skin, White Mass emphasizes the ultimately objectifying and alienating character of intersubjective recognition, especially when these relationships are played out in contexts of structured racial and cultural hierarchy. Indeed, throughout his text, Fanon describes the experience of colonial recognition in profoundly negative terms, like being fixed or walled in by the violating gaze of another. So far from being emancipatory and self-confirming, then, recognition is instead cast by Fanon as a suffocating reification, a hemorrhage that causes the colonized to collapse into self-objectification. However, unlike the situation of Sartre's portrait of the Jew, an anti-Semite Jew, when fixated on the colonized black subject, the gaze takes on a new significance for Fanon. I am not given a second chance. I am overdetermined from the outside. I am a slave not to the idea that others have of me, but to my appearance. So how do colonized populations tend to respond to this in Fanon's work? According to Fanon, like Sartre's rendition of the Jew in the context of anti-Semitic racism, the colonized most common response is that of flight. As Fanon describes, colonial recognition will often produce within the colonized assumptions the will to self-annihilate, to deny through a number of practices that difference that is seen as repugnant in the eyes of the colonizer. Once internalized, these derogatory images or self-images often produce a pathological yearning to, quote, be recognized not as black but as white. Fanon uses a number of terms to describe this process. Inferiority complex, psychoexistential complex, neuroses, alienation are the most common. All of these designations are used by Fanon to describe the specific modes of colonial thought, desire, and patterns of behavior which implicitly commit us to our own domination. Seen in this light, there's nothing inherent about the perceived inferiority attributed to colonized subjects by the dominant racist colonial society, nor is there anything natural about our so-called complexes that we suffer as a result. Both are the product of colonial social relationships. If there's a flaw, Fanon says, it lies not in the soul of the colonized, but in his environment. Now, it's this problematic that Fanon sets out to address in the bulk of his work. Namely, what forms of decolonial struggle or praxis must we individually and collectively undertake to subvert the interplay between structure and subjectivity that sustain colonial relationships over time? For Fanon, in situations where the reproduction of colonial rule does not rely solely on force, it requires the production of colonial subjects that acquiesce to the power relationships that are imposed on us. Internalization thus occurs when the social relationships of colonization, along with the forms of recognition and representation that serve to prop them up, come to be seen as true or natural to the colonized themselves. The status of the native is a neurosis, explains Sartre in the preface to The Wretched of the Earth, introduced and maintained by the colonists in the colonized with their consent. So similar to how Gramsci viewed the reproduction of class dominance in situations absent ongoing state violence or repression, colonial hegemony is maintained through a combination of coercion and consent that Fanon saw as managed through the imposed and or delegated exchange of recognition from the colonizer to the colonized. Under such conditions, colonial domination appears, quote, more subtle, less bloody, to use Fanon's words. Now this, quote, psychological economic structure is what Fanon produces a condition of stagnancy and inertia that characterizes, in Fanon's analysis, the colonial world. In The Wretched of the Earth, for example, is littered with passages that highlight the fundamentally passive and stagnant condition that the colonial situation produces. The colonial world, writes Fanon, is compartmentalized, Manichean, and petrified. It is a world in which the colonial subject is penned in, lies coiled and robbed, taught to remain in its place and never overstep its limits. Although this internalized negative energy produced by this hostile situation will first express itself against the colonized own people, quote, this is a period when black turns on black, writes Fanon, when colonial violence assumes a black or Arab face. Over time, it will begin to incite a negative reaction in the colonized subject. Now, it's my claim that this reaction indicates a breakdown of the psychological structure of internalized colonialism. The colonized subject, once degraded, impoverished, abused, begins to look at the colonized world's, the colonialists' world with envy, contempt, and resentment. The colonized begin to desire that which has been denied them, land and freedom, dignity. They begin dreaming of revenge. Now, although Fanon's quick to insist that this, quote, legitimate desire for revenge, born of the colonized subject's nascent hatred and resentment toward the colonists, cannot alone foster decolonization, I want to suggest, and I suggest in my book, that these reactive emotions nonetheless mark an important turning point in the individual and collective coming to consciousness of the colonized. More specifically, I think that they represent a process in which the colonized begin to externalize that which was previously internalized, a purging of the so-called inferiority complex of the colonized subject. In the context of internalized colonialism, the material conditions that condition the colonial situation appear muted to the colonized because they are understood to be the product of one's cultural deficiencies. In such a context, the formation of what Fanon calls an enemy, colonial enemy, that is a source external to ourselves that we come to associate with, quote, our misfortunes, signifies the beginning of a collapse of this internalized psychic structure. For Fanon, only once this psychic rupture has occurred, or to use Jean Amory's phrase, once these sterile emotions come to recognize themselves for what they really are, consequences of social repression, can the colonized then cast their rage in a new direction. In the face of internalized colonial oppression, then, where the assimilative machinery of settler colonial rule violently aims to transfer outsiders, i.e. indigenous subjects, into insiders, colonial subject citizens, and in doing so the colonized are conditioned to view themselves as their own worst enemy, coming to see the world as a Manichean structure divided in two emerges as a really important political position. In the words of political theorist George Chicarello-Mar, it is only the, quote, fanatical embrace, reversal, it's only the fanatical embrace, reversal, and redeployment of the categories that structure the world that allows colonized to transform the ostensible frozenness of Manichean division back into dialectical motion. For Fanon, coming to experience and view the world through the oppositional structure of colonial Manicheanism, or binaries, offers crucial insight into its eventual transformation. And this is what I gather probably Patrick Wolf was talking about when he, in his work on recuperating binaries in settler colonial contexts. Importantly, Fanon also insists, I'm almost done, that these reactive motions can prompt the colonized to turn away from both our assimilative fascination with and futile attempts to gain recognition from our masters, and to instead revalue and affirm the worth of Indigenous cultural traditions and social practices that are systematically denigrated but never fully destroyed in the colonial situation. So after years of dehumanization, the colonized begin to resent the assumed, in Fanon's words, supremacy of white values that has served to justify our continued exploitation and domination. In the decolonial period, writes Fanon, the colonized masses thumb their noses up at these very values, shower them with insults, and vomit them up. Eventually, this newfound resentment of colonial values prompts the colonized to turn to their own traditions, civilizations, cultural practices and traditions, which serve to generate feelings of pride and self-certainty that is not available to us in the colonial situation. For Fanon, this anti-racist racism, and there he's quoting but not attributing it to Sartre, the determination to defend one's own skin is characteristic of the colonized response to colonial oppression, and it provides us with the motivating struggle to fight. Although Fanon ultimately saw this example of cultural self-recognition as an expression akin to Nietzschean ressentiment, that is, as a limited and ultimately retrograde reaction to colonial power, he nonetheless claimed it as necessary for the same reason he affirmed the transformative potential of emotional factors like anger and resentment. Now at this point I turn our attentions in my work to the contributions that Indigenous scholars and activists have added to our understanding of the entanglement of contemporary recognition politics with the operation of settler colonial power. I felt that it was crucial to conclude my my study on this way because Indigenous contributions to anti-colonial thought and practice have been generally underappreciated in the Canadian context, and I would assume here as well, for their transformative value, but perhaps more importantly, or just importantly, their theoretical sophistication. Indeed, as suggested above, even Fanon viewed the decolonial potential of Indigenous cultural practices as fundamentally undercut by their kind of retrograde character, by the fact that they focused on the past over the present and the future. And I suggest on this point that we reach a limit to Fanon's anti-colonial analysis, especially when it's uprooted and travels as a framework to make sense of settler colonial dynamics that inform our current circumstances. Although Fanon importantly kind of eschews an evolutionary theory of historical development in which societies are viewed as as traveling from the most primitive to the most civilized, he remains wedded to a very progressive dialectical conception of social transformation that does privilege old forms over, new forms over old. And it's when this dialectic is applied to colonial situation, the result, I claim, is a conceptualization of culture that mimics how Marxists understand class. That is, as a transitional category of identification that colonized peoples must struggle to transcend as soon as that emerges as a form of identification. And this view, I simply does not provide much insight, I think, into the kind of the relationship between settler colonialism and Indigenous resistance. Culture is a substantive, not instrumental force in our struggles. And culture is not, to quote Cayuga Alfred, instrumental to the surging against state power, but it is the very means of our struggle. And I think I'll end there. So, message. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a rich essay and set of opportunities to engage. So we'll take about 15 minutes, and if you have some questions, we'll put them forward. I will say at the outset that I will, with this many people, I'll be kind of forced into a situation of asking you to keep your questions limited, comments limited, so that we can take as many as possible. And I may intervene if necessary. Are there any students who might have some responses to begin?
I can ask a question real quick. thank you for your presentation and coming to the American Indian Program to share this really thought-provoking work. I just have a couple questions based on, there's a lot of issues on the table. And going back to Marx's primitive accumulation, you have two critiques that you just identified, the temporal critique and then also the normative development critique. And with normative development critique, I was wondering if you, and I think you're putting together a lot of Marxist thinking in order to draw that out within the primitive accumulation, because it's not something I think is explicit in those chapters. And so, do you lose the focus on the basic contradiction of capitalism if you get rid of that? And then the other thing, well, I'll just stop there.
Yeah, no, that's what, there's been some critiques of, like, internally with Marxism to say that, like, or with Marx's work that you've kind of, if this is the case, like, if this is indeed what Marx is doing, then the engine drops out of this whole, this entire theoretical framework. No, I don't think so. I just think that there's, I'd have to think about it in terms of a dialectic and like in the contradictions aspect, but I think what happens is a dialectic between core and periphery becomes as central than a dialectic internal to Western society between workers and bosses. Might be one way that we can reframe it. But in terms of the question of whether or not Marx actually did that, like he revisited it to such a substantive degree that now he affirms the worth of alternative modes of production as a potential alternative to capitalist development. I think it's pretty clear that he was on that route, even though he might not have stated it as such. So he argues, or he responds to a few letters from Russian populists and peasant populists that want to kind of, that were a bit peeved at his writings, especially on primitive accumulation, because they portrayed this necessary stage that would, from their struggles, kind of result in the death of like the Russian commune. And Marx responded to Vera Zulik saying, no, that's not what I'm saying. This isn't meant to be kind of a trans-historical story about the development of all societies. I'm just talking about Western Europe right now. And and then he puts up a number of caveats which he says need to be in place, which conveniently for the Russians are in place. So the commune can't be ethnic, it has to be national or civic, and he's got some pretty, for our purposes as Native folks, some pretty derogatory assumptions about kinship and its parochiality. That capital, or that technology must be wielded, the technologies that have been brought to us by capitalism have to be wielded in our struggles, but we can't become enslaved by them. So he has a number of things. But importantly, I think what he does do, which opens up this question of indigenous alternatives by virtue of our alternative modes of production and relationships of land, is that if you don't have to go through the assimilative machinery of wage work under capitalism, it by nature assumes that there's going to be a diversity of different forms of development, because wage labor is what produces this kind of crushingly assimilative effect. It churns, in Marx's own words, the world over in terms of its own. It churns everybody over in the image of capital. So if we don't have to go through that, then it at least opens up the possibility of a diversity of alternatives. And that's what is that possibility that I seize on, and I think that what Indigenous peoples are articulating in their struggles, especially when they're articulated in a kind of more radical form. Sorry, you should have cut me off.
So in that sense, do you know Frank Rosebaum's essay, Marx and the Iroquois?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just wondering about the ethnological notebooks and what you think. I mean, he was reading Lewis Henry Morgan, which is actually not the best source in certain kinds of ways, but nevertheless, he was turning in that direction in the later work.
Yeah, the problem with a lot of like the ethnological notebooks is that like that stuff's written in, like it's not translated entirely into English yet, and he's writing in Latin, German, Russian, and French and English. So accessibility for me is, I don't speak all those languages, I know accessibility is one issue. And then, so if you're not dealing with the actual Marx's notebooks on these sorts of things, then our interpretation has been really skewed through in particular angles, really deterministic interpretation of Marx's own understanding of Morgan, which has a host of issues with it. So yeah, no, I think that like they're in the works to being published, and I think they'll be a really important source when they're edited and published. But until then, I just flag the fact that this is a period in Marx's late life where he starts to turn more to looking at non-Western social formations and struggles, partially because he's revisiting this really kind of Eurocentric teleological narrative that he's starting to abandon.
Speaking of the commune, Kristen Ross was just here. She brought.
Yeah, no, I heard. Or
Yeah.
here she's here today, isn't she?
She was here yesterday giving a seminar for those of us who participate in a particular project. But there were some really interesting correlations, and we talked about them between what the commune was doing and moving towards a completely decentralized form of governance, which echoes in ways indigenous forms of governance. And also moving away from a productive or growth model of economics to a sustainable model of economics that had some pretty interesting echoes in terms of, indigenous Zapatista manifesto, for example, stuff that's going on in Latin America that's sort of trying to make a synthesis out of Marxism, a certain kind of Marxism, and a certain kind of indigenous thought. And I'm thinking of Leslie Soko's almanac of that as well, which tries to do that.
Yeah, and I haven't, again, my friend Robert Nichols is exploring these more, but if you look at Marx after 1871, for instance, and that's kind of an arbitrary, he's starting to change, like he's constantly kind of also undergoing a form of, not explicit, but implicit auto-critique, I think, through his work. But it really kind of becomes pronounced in the 1870s and then to the end of his life. And I actually think that I could make an argument that if it weren't for the kind of ideological and polarizing battles over the international and the split between anarchists and in particular between Bakunin and Marx, that there's a little bit more kind of affinity with like Kropotkin in particular over kind of the potential of the commune. In terms of where Marx stood on it, so and that could be really, and then you're into more terrain, I think, in terms of affirmation of the worth of kind of past social formations for present struggle, because like Reclus and Kropotkin were quite a bit better on that.
Right. And that's what Ross is trying to do, is move away from the Bakunin Marx split and look more at Kropotkin and those figures. Thanks.
I'm a visiting scholar here from GBM and the stage program, and my background is I have done postcolonial studies in the UK, so in the USA. My probably question is little probably naive or simple. If you compare with China and Indian indigenous culture, I think the Indian indigenous culture has a certain kind of respect for its uniqueness or wisdom sometimes, and where apparently you're aware of your traditional style and the culture and even a civilization. That I think was not probably recognized for the so-called Black Africans or Caribbean people who are thought to be cannibals. So I just wondered how these sort of cultural aspects feel into your theory or your comparison.
Yeah, well, they're foundational. Partially, like one of my critiques of Fanon is that he treats cultural politics or struggle as instrumental and not substantive. So they're a means but not an end. So he sees the turn to tradition as being fundamental because it kind of jump starts the kind of dialectic again. And he's less, I claimed he's less committed to some understanding that this ought to be a lasting feature of our struggle and indeed kind of inform what an alternative future might look like culture. Now, I've been taken to task on this by people that I really respect, like Gio Chikara wrote a response to my book, and he kind of teases out where tradition plays a more substantive role in Fanon. And I think we're still kind of, we could keep giving textual examples of like, being like, well, here's where he seems really kind of instrumental, here's where he seems to be more substantive in his treatment of culture. So I think we could both make convincing arguments, but then I started to think more like this is also a methodological insight from Fanon. And his understanding of decolonization is a form of self-affirmation where it's the reconstruction of our own values, not the values of others. So when somebody like Jared Sexton makes a claim that I only use Fanon to a certain point and then I have to turn away from him because the radical black tradition isn't good enough, which is like an obscene sort of, I'm paraphrasing him, but I'm like, no, Fanon's own theoretical insights is that this is a struggle that is undertaken by and for the colonized themselves, the creation and drawing off of their own sort of values. So of course, as much as I've learned from Fanon and the black radical tradition in terms of their critique of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and all of these, in the generative part of this, it's going to be us that's doing it in solidarity and in relationship to others. So even if Fanon's says this on culture, he's weak on this on culture, I think that in terms of how we go about making change is going to be determined by those who are subject to the various power relationship. And in that case, we're going to be drawing off of indigenous traditions.
I wanted to ask, I don't know if this is a question yet, but in hearing you speak and hearing you bring up the sort of indigenous feminist alert flag put up in your own sort of work, in reading your book, focus on rejecting the politics of recognition, but the end result of that recognition that you wave to, but I haven't seen it dealt with, is reconciliation as an outcome of that recognition. And it seems that Fanon, in focusing on the psychological response to psychological violence written into the minds and individual bodies as that experience of alienation, as pointed to in this seemingly non-spectacular violence waged against women and children under boarding schools and MMIW, that the TRC process in Canada seems like an attempt to incorporate or absolve or let the steam off of that internal psychic violence and realization of they are the enemy and I need to hate them.
Yep.
So when I heard what's your name, Jody, say that she wanted to be an agent of reconciliation and for the cabinet, I was frightened.
Yeah, I haven't really engaged in those debates because people need to settle, we all need to kind of settle down a bit. We had a new change in government, and we have had an almost explicitly anti-Indian or anti-Native administration in power now for a decade. And we have a new Liberal government which is really into kind of the language of recognition and reconciliation, and to be critical of them right now is like can get you in some trouble, so I just sit back and say, yeah, no, like let's just see how the chips fall on this one. But in terms of reconciliation, the TRC and most of these transitional justice mechanisms on reconciliation are really not very good at dealing with resentment and like people who vigilantly want to want these. This is a reminder of what was done, and it will ensure that I remain vigilant that it will never happen again. But it also can be destructive, self-destructive. So the stuff that I do on reconciliation, I want to admit that when Indigenous people speak of reconciliation, they're speaking of it specifically with a few things in mind. One is healing, so reconciling oneself with oneself and the violence that has been perpetrated and lives on in our bodies and our minds. Reconciliation is a political project of achieving some sort of treaty relationship of reciprocity between two different camps. But then there's reconciliation that's promoted by the state, and it's destroying the chances of the first two forms of reconciliation taking hold. And that's my concern, is like, because we're all, like, reconciliation means so many things to different people, that it's hard to pinpoint which one's doing what work. And my concern is the reconciliation of the state, and even kind of embodied in beyond, like in the relatively limited mandate of the TRC, isn't equipped to deal. It's actually not only not equipped to deal with reconciliation in those first two good senses. It's actively undermining their realization. And this is the concern with the new Liberal government, is because they're not. They know how to manage this relationship in ways that a racist neoliberal government didn't. And I make this claim in the book. I'm like, the problem with Harper is that his social conservatism outstripped the stuff that he needed, or his commitments to neoconservatism through kind of market mechanisms. So he hated natives so much that he would agitate and provoke and it blew up in his face. Whereas you can have the same market effects by actually doling out recognition or incorporating Indigenous peoples into the market through participation, all of these sorts of things that the Liberals are so good at. Harper, because of his disdain for First Nations, wouldn't do, and it just kind of blew up in his face with I don't know more and stuff like that. So now we're going to go back, is my prediction, we're going to go back to a really more slippery, hard to pin down form of dispossession that also zaps the critique out from under us, because then we see like entitled, greedy, whiny Indians who are just not who are not satisfied with all of the stuff that's been given out to us, and it's going to be hard. It was easy during Harper as a critic. It was hard materially for people, and that was distributed across our communities asymmetrically, obviously, according to sex and gender in particular. But now it's going to be difficult to kind of pin down because they're way better at this than conservatives are. So
I think we have time for one more question. Comment?
Charlotte?
I wonder whether you say something about the British Columbia Treaty Commission that's going on, limping along right now. Does that sort of slot within the analysis that you just made of the TRC? Is it sort of Liberal Party project which might become this new administration, or is it structurally flawed in the ways that you've been, as per the analysis?
It's like structurally flawed to the core. It's a comprehensive land claim, so it's only recognizing Indigenous land rights in order to extinguish them, or at least make them compatible with economic development and settlement on Indian lands. It's been that since 1973 when the comprehensive land claims process was established. So there's nothing different in terms of in terms of the treaty process. It's an attempt to gain certainty over who owns the land or what are the rules pertaining to the land in order to attract investment and economic development on those territories for the purposes of capitalist development and settlement. Like, it's not even, like, the courts have said that, the policy says that, like, it's actually easy to critique because it just lays it out there for you. The problem with that is that economic certainty, it's a long, drawn-out process, and in order to kind of facilitate the type of development that British Columbia and Canada wants, it's too slow. So what the new strategy is like, yeah, sure, we'll work towards settling these claims, but the most important thing that the state has to do is directly get First Nations people in conversation with industry through work and IBAs, so impact benefit agreements, and usually some sort of kind of commitment to jobs. And that's how they're doing it, is like through these non-constitutional, non-political negotiations, but just economic incentives to get on board with projects. So that was Christy Clark's attempt. Her attempt is like, we're gonna get these development projects pushed through not politically because of the certainty that comes out of land claims. We're just gonna push them through economically by putting First Nations directly in conversation with industry. So that's kind of how the right-of-way for Northern Gateway is hoping that it will get this through, is through First Nations consent now under the language of consultation and through impact benefit agreements, which is hard to do when your community's economically in duress and all these sorts of things. So.
Right, but so the treaty process is a kind of is in ruins and has been recognised as a non-starter by plenty of First Nations. Anyway,
yeah, partially because they recognize it as still being about extinguishment. Like this is like, it's still you're extinguishing your Aboriginal rights and title for what's in the agreement, even though it's not using that language anymore. And so you've had First Nations abandon that process for years now. But I think more fundamentally, it's, I guess what I'm saying, it's structurally flawed to the core. Like, it's philosophically, like, clearly colonial in its origins and its purpose.
Well, Glenn, thank you so much again for such a rich paper, and if you help me one more time, thank him for being with us today, and we'll be serving a lunch, and some more informal conversation can follow for a little while, and we'll move to the seminar.